So it's time to talk about error handling in our application. And what kind of errors can we expect from our server? Well, we've already seen that we're going to get 400 bad request errors for validation problems. And we can also get 500 type errors. But whatever errors is our server going to return to our client? Well, we should be returning 404 not found for when a user requests a resource that isn't found in our database. When we add authentication, we should be returning a 401 not authorized if the user tries to access a resource they're not authorized to access. And we also have 500 errors when the server throws an exception that we're not expecting. And those are the three main errors that we're going to deal with initially. Well, not the authentication one yet, because we haven't got to that stage of the course. But we're certainly going to look at, well, we've looked at 400 errors that we return, and we also need to look at 404s. And the question becomes, because of the nature of the way that we're architecting this application, is where do we throw the errors? Where do we send the errors back? Well, our activities controller is pretty dumb. It's got one job, which is to receive HTTP requests and send out HTTP responses. Now, if our API controllers were a bit more intelligent, then this could handle the logic for sending back things like a 404 not found. Let's go back to our values controller, which is not a dumb controller. This one actually has access to our context. And if we were using this approach inside our application, and we wouldn't necessarily be injecting the context in here, but if we were using a different pattern, such as the repository pattern, we would go out to our repository and try and get a resource. That would send back either the resource or an error. And then inside our controller, we could say, well, if I don't have this, then I'm going to return something to the client. And what we could do, for example, in this case, just because we have access to our values controller, I could say if value, for instance, is equal to null, then what I could do inside this controller is return a not found, because I'm inside the context of an API controller. And we have access to a variety of HTTP responses that we can return to the client. And if I go back to Postman, and I go back to module 2 and I say try and get a value, and enter a value that I know doesn't exist inside my API and click send, then I get the correct response back, which is a 404 not found. Now the problem becomes in our application, let's say I go to the delete method, for instance, and supposing I wanted to delete something that didn't exist, what we're doing at the moment is we're throwing an exception. And the reason we're throwing an exception is because we simply don't have access to the API controller context, where we have access to the HTTP responses that we can send back from there. So when we're using this particular pattern of this CQRS and mediator, we really need to make a choice about how we want to handle this kind of situation. Now there's two schools of thought on this. One of them is that we always return back a result object to the API controller. And then in this result object, we could also include the error from the API. And then in our activities controller, instead of just returning from here, we could check the response and then either send back the error response or send back the object, the resource. And that approach is a good one, it works fine, but then it makes our API controllers a bit smarter and they've got a bit more responsibility. And I kind of like to keep the API controller really thin, as in as simple as possible, and literally just have it doing the one job of receiving requests and returning responses. So even though, and let's go back to our delete method, even though exceptions are more expensive, they do provide us with a way to stop the execution of this particular request whenever the error occurred, and it gives us the ability to return something to the client. Now, people do say that exceptions should be exceptional, and we shouldn't use exceptions lightly. But when you think about it, our exceptions are going to be exceptional. we're not in our client application going to give our users the ability to, let's say, delete an activity that isn't in our database, for instance. So even though exceptions are a little bit more expensive than just what we looked at inside our values controller, we are still going to use exceptions to cancel the execution of this request and return out of it. And that's the approach we're going to take. But we're not going to return exceptions to the client. We're going to intercept the exception and then turn that into an HTTP response that we then send back to the client. And what we're going to do is take a look at how we set this up next.